Mandy? All right, here we go. Thank you, everyone. I think we're ready to go. I have good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Wilson. I am the executive principal here at Churchville-Chili Senior High School. This evening, I have the special honor of welcoming our guest, Dr. Mendoza. And tonight, we have a special presentation on the topic of vaping epidemic, the vaping epidemic that we in our community and all communities are facing. We have about an hour set aside for this evening until about 8 o'clock. There are questions that are coming in from the community. So I will be moderating the questions as we start this special presentation. To start, I just want to say that this presentation is made possible because of our Flash network. Flash is our family learning and support for home network, and they provide learning opportunities and resources to parents and caregivers of our Churchville-Chili students that will enhance students' educational and life experiences. I'd like to thank and recognize the team made up of administrators, staff, board members, counselors, parents, and support staff. So without their organization, we wouldn't make this possible. With that said, allow me to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Michael Mendoza. Dr. Mendoza, if you'd bear with me, I'll read some of your credentials just to help introduce. Sure. Dr. Mendoza is the 9th Commissioner of the Public Health Commissioner of Public Health for Monroe County. He is appointed as an associate professor at the University of Rochester in the Departments of Family Medicine, Public Health Sciences, and Nursing. As Commissioner of Public Health, Dr. Mendoza's goal is to improve population health by strengthening and collaborating between clinical medicine and public health in our community. He has a particular focus in leveraging science and best practices to address the disparities in health and healthcare in Monroe County. Dr. Mendoza joined the Health Department in 2016. In his role, Dr. Mendoza oversees the Health Department's $61 million budget and over 250 employees and contractors whose responsibilities span a diverse array of services designed to protect public health in Monroe County. He received his medical degree and undergraduate degrees from the University of Chicago, his master's in public health from the University of Illinois, and his master's in business administration from the Simon Business School at the University of Rochester. He completed his graduate medical training at the University of California, San Francisco, and served an additional year as the chief resident at the San Francisco General Hospital. He's an active member of our community, serving on the board of directors of Willow Domestic Violence of Rochester, Common Ground Health, and the Rochester Regional Health Information Organization. In his spare time, Dr. Mendoza enjoys spending time with his wife, his two children, and their 2 golden doodles. His hobbies include running, cycling, and cooking. Please welcome Dr. Mendoza. Dr. Mendoza, thank you for being here to speak on this very important topic of the vaping epidemic that we face.
Very good. Thank you, Principal Wilson, and thank you to everybody who is here joining us tonight. I want to spend the next half hour, 45 minutes or so, providing a little bit of background on why vaping is so important. We've been thinking about vaping a great deal in the community. Obviously, COVID and a lot of other issues have grabbed headlines of the last year or so. But vaping really represents a concern of mine because it is an epidemic among our younger adults and student population. And as we look ahead to public health in the future, we will get behind or beyond the COVID pandemic, and we will be left with all of the issues that we were thinking about before COVID. And probably even more so, because we know that the COVID pandemic has inflicted a great deal of harm in terms of mental health, disconnectedness, social isolation, and a whole host of other things. And so I think it's important. I think it's great that you're hosting a talk tonight on vaping. I want to broaden the scope a little bit to think more about addiction, because vaping and e-cigarettes really are just the tip of the iceberg, as we'll talk about. But I really want to recognize you and your community for shining a light on this really important topic. So to get things started, I just want to make sure everybody understands what we're dealing with here. When we talk about e-cigarettes, vape devices, which comes from vaporizing devices, what we're dealing with really are the same sort of idea here is that you've got a device with a battery, with a liquid that gets heated up very, very high temperatures, becomes vaporized. Okay, so it's not a smoke. Okay, it's not burning in the sense that you're burning a piece of paper, but you're vaporizing it, which is a very different chemical process than burning. And that vapor is what's then inhaled into the user's lungs. Okay, so this is a very different thing. This is not like cigarette smoke in that you're lighting something on fire. This is heating something to a very, very high temperature, which causes it to go from a liquid to a gas. Okay, that's a very different chemical process than what we're dealing with when we're combustible, using a combustible cigarette. So over the years, these e-cigarettes or vape devices have evolved. And on the far left there, these were initially marketed as look-alike cigarettes. The thinking back in the early 2000s and mid 2000s was that these e-cigarettes would be potentially used as a smoking cessation device. Turns out that the FDA has not found any evidence that these devices work in that way. But these devices have persisted because a lot of people have found them to be convenient, useful, and perhaps less undesirable than the traditional combustible cigarette. And so as you can see here throughout the years, these have become more sleek, more cool. The Juul device came out in 2015. This is a device that has been very popular with younger adults and high school students and younger. It is very sleek. It's very easy to use. It's chargeable in a USB port on the side of your computer. And for those who may not know what this looks like, it can look just like a USB hard drive, one that you might carry a file on and so forth. These Hyde devices, these are the really popular ones now here on the far right. They look very similar to the Juul, except that they can hold a higher quantity of the liquid, and so you can use it for longer. And just like the Juul, it can be disposable. So these devices are very, easy to conceal. We have done presentations in schools where we create a makeshift bedroom, if you will, and we talk about all of the ways that students and children can conceal these devices. And the market for this stuff is quite remarkable. There are water bottles that just look like your typical Nalgene bottle, but the bottom screws off and you can store Joules in the bottle. There are a whole host of these devices that you can buy online, and they are very concerning to a lot of parents and to us in the community because you can literally bring these into the school and many times conceal them from teachers and other people in the schools. But what gets us concerned about these e-cigarettes is that there is a liquid in the e-cigarette that contains a number of chemicals. Now, like I said earlier, these chemicals are in general safe when used either as something that's consumed by mouth. So these carrier liquids, 95% of the liquid in these e-liquids are propylene glycol and glycerin. These have been deemed safe by the FDA when you consume them by mouth. And so they're found in a lot of candies and other drinks and so forth. But what has not been studied by the FDA is what happens when you vaporize them, okay? So things that are safe in other settings, used in other applications, are not necessarily safe when you vaporize them. Nicotine, we know a lot about, okay? Nicotine is in the liquid, whether it's burned, whether it's consumed, or whether it's vaporized. It is very, very well known to be highly addictive, and nicotine is present in almost all of the e-cigarette devices because that is the addictive component that gets the user to come back for more. And what's really concerning are these other chemicals, okay? These other chemicals are the ones that give a lot of these e-cigarettes their flavor, okay? So there are these flavorants, and the list is long. It looks like a chemical, textbook. All of these flavor chemicals, again, have been used in other settings when consumed as a food product, but we don't know very much about what they do when you vaporize them. And there are some chemicals that we'll get into next that when you vaporize them, it turns out that they cause quite a bit of health concerns. And then sometimes you'll find cannabis or marijuana or alcohol in these devices. Now, alcohol, when it's vaporized, doesn't give you the same euphoria that drinking alcohol will. But again, vaporizing alcohol is a very different process than consuming it. So when it comes to these chemicals, it turns out that these flavors actually are quite suspicious. Many people in the audience may remember the concerns that we had in 2000 with the microwave popcorn flavoring that was added to microwave popcorn. So everybody knows what movie popcorn tastes like. Well, there was an effort in the early 2000s to try to recreate that taste in microwave popcorn, which was actually very popular in 2000, not as popular now. And they would create this chemical that they can put on popcorn. And when we consumed it as consumers, we would microwave it, and it was generally safe. But they learned in 2000 that in the factory, when the people were working in the factory, inhaling all of the chemicals that created that movie butter taste for the microwave popcorn, all of these individuals ended up getting lung disease. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is. In 2017, there was a small epidemic in a coffee factory where, again, they were trying to add flavors like the hazelnut and so forth to the regular coffee beans. And then when they roasted those coffee beans, the people working in that factory would end up inhaling that vaporized flavor chemical, and that would cause lung disease. So that lung disease looks like this. On the left there is a normal bronchiole. All right, so when you think of the pulmonary tree, you've got your trachea, you've got your main stem bronchi, those two large airways that lead into the lungs. And then you've got the bronchioles, which span the distance from the bronchus to the alveoli. And that bronchiole area is a major traffic pattern, if you will, to get lungs to the end of the pulmonary tree in the alveoli. Well, what happens when you inhale these chemicals is that you get this very odd inflammation of the airways that makes it very difficult for air to pass through. And when that chemical reaction sets in place in the bronchioles, there's scarring, there's all this inflammation, the airway gets to be very small, and it turns out that none of this is reversible. So once this happens, it's permanent. Okay, so it's very much like asthma and emphysema and COPD and other types of lung disease. And this all happens from the inhalation of these chemicals. And so that's what makes us very nervous, because there is no regulation on the chemicals that are used in these e-cigarettes. And what's very concerning, and I won't get into the details of all of this, but this is a study that looked at the effect of the vapors on the lungs and showed that they actually change the way the genetic makeup of our lung tissue develops as we age. Okay, so if you think about that, we're changing the genetics of our lung tissue in response to the exposure to these high temperature vapors that are found in e-cigarettes. So when you think about what happens when you change the genetic makeup of cells, that is how cancer happens. Okay, and we don't have a cure for cancer, but we certainly know how cancer happens. And cancer happens when the genetic makeup of cells is changed. And so not unlike cigarette smoking, e-cigarette use has been shown in papers like this one to change the genetic makeup of how the proteins in our cells are created in response to the genes that are changing in response to the exposure to these vapors. So that's just what happens when you inhale typically the flavor component of these e-cigarettes. Another really important part of the e-cigarette is the nicotine. Now, nicotine is a neurotransmitter. It's found in our brain. It stimulates the central nervous system. And so those of you who are familiar with nicotine, who may have smoked or may have used a vape device in the past, know that nicotine will raise our blood pressure. It creates a little bit of a euphoria. It raises our alertness. It makes us a little bit more awake at first. Okay, once you become tolerant of nicotine, all of those effects are not nearly as strong. But what is definitely true about nicotine is that it's a neurotransmitter that activates the dopamine system in the brain. And dopamine is another neurotransmitter in the brain that is involved with pleasure. And so dopamine is what is released when we have a really good meal. And so when you enjoy a meal, dopamine is released in the brain, and your brain gets used to that sort of feeling of, I've had a really good meal. People who exercise and run are familiar with the, quote, runner's high. Well, the runner's high is endorphins and dopamine. And so when I go running and when I go for a bike ride, I get to a point where I feel the surge of energy. That's dopamine. Okay, so that can be a good thing, but it can also be used against us. And so nicotine, opioids, cocaine, methamphetamine, all of these other drugs can also stimulate the dopamine system in our brain. But dopamine is one of those kinds of chemicals that is highly implicated in addiction. And as our brain is developing from age 12 to age 16, even up to age 20, it's very clear that the more our dopamine system is activated in our brain, the more sensitized we are to things that are highly addictive. And this is why it's so concerning that people in their teens are using these vaping devices, to me, because they're activating that dopamine system and making themselves much more prone to addiction in their later years. And by the time you get to be 20 and 25, the hard wiring in your brain is done. You really cannot change that very much. You can obviously learn and think and reflect and do a whole host of other things. But when it comes to that dopamine system in our brain, we're hardwired toward addiction or not by the time we're 20, 21, 22. So it's very important that parents, I'm a parent, teachers, students, that you think about this, because you're setting yourselves up for potentially a problem in addiction down the road. And addiction is not a choice. Addiction is a disease. It's just like high blood pressure or diabetes or any other chronic medical concern. It's not as though people who are addicted have a choice. It's not that they wanted to be addicted, and it's actually not possible for them to want to not be addicted. Okay, this is a disease of the brain, and our brains are hardwired toward addiction early in life. And so we want to do everything we can to prevent them. Now, in addition to the chronic effects of vaping, it turns out in 2019, we had a really big scare across the United States. And here at the University of Rochester, one of my colleagues, Dr. Nick Naka, is a toxicologist who works in the emergency room. So if anybody's been into the emergency room, Dr. Naka and his wife are two of the physicians who are there. But Dr. Naka has a very strong interest in toxicology and poisoning. And so in July of 2019, one of his colleagues wrote to him and said that they have found 3 mysterious cases of young, healthy people who came in with really bad lung disease and a history of using a vape device, okay? One of them was intubated, which means in the ICU on a breathing machine, and the other 2 were very sick in the hospital. And this was very unusual because these were teenagers. These were athletes, like many of you are probably, who had no reason to be in the hospital except that they had used a vaping device in the last 2 weeks. And it turns out across the country, we were seeing the same thing. In the same month, in July of 2019, 8 cases of the same thing were seen in the state of Wisconsin. In August, the state health commissioner here in New York State issued an advisory calling our attention to these then unexplained vaping-associated lung illnesses. Again, healthy people who had nothing in their history to suspect them to have a lung problem other than that they used these vaping devices. North Carolina, same thing. They started to see what was causing this, and they started to wonder whether THC or cannabis or marijuana-containing vaping devices were the culprit. The New England Journal of Medicine and the New York Times started publishing these CT scans, these CAT scans of the lungs. And none of these lung scans are normal. These are the lung scans of people who are in the ICU on a breathing machine. And these, all of these individuals were young, healthy people prior to all of this. So later in September, I issued an advisory advising all people to stop vaping because we did not know what was going on, and we did not want young, healthy people in the ICU on breathing machines for no obvious reason. So long story short, a lot of studies happened in late 2019, trying to understand what was going on with all of this. And it turned out that in almost all of these cases, about 80+% of them, the user had used a vaping device in which street level THC e-liquid had been either used as the entire liquid in the vape or as a component in that vape. And so we went through a little bit of an epidemic in early 2020, where we saw 64 deaths across the country in young people. The median age here is 24 years old. Okay, the median age of people who had this illness is 24 years old, and that is very young. And so we learned a lot about this. We learned that you have to be very careful about where you get these e-liquids, because if they contain a chemical that when vaporized causes this chronic acute lung disease, it obviously can cause some serious trouble for the user. So I know one of the questions that often comes up is, can these e-cigarettes be used as a quit smoking device? And there was a lot of hope. And I remember when these came out as a physician, I have a lot of patients who smoke, and I want nothing else than to help them to be healthy. And if we can find a safe and healthy way for them to quit smoking, I'm all for it. Unfortunately, these e-cigarettes have been studied quite extensively, and there really hasn't been a very clear picture about their role in helping people to quit smoking. So obviously the marketing is very strong. The makers of the e-cigarettes want us to believe this. And to be fair, there is a potential that these e-cigarettes can be useful in smoking cessation, but the research isn't there just yet. There are some studies that show that there is some benefit, but it has not been FDA approved. It really hasn't been endorsed by the American Lung Association or other notable bodies in pulmonary disease. And we know that it's harmful in many cases for youth, young adults, certainly pregnant women. And so in order for it to be useful, you have to stop smoking, okay? So I've got patients who use traditional cigarettes and they go to e-cigarettes. E-cigarettes may be the lesser of two evils, but for there to be any benefit, you actually have to stop using traditional cigarettes. And then you can start talking about, well, are there ways to use e-cigarettes safely? But that's a discussion that we have among adults. And that's not something we want to have as a conversation with younger people. So when we think about how do we get ourselves out of this, we have to think about how we got ourselves into this. And we have to ask ourselves, what's the problem? Okay, are e-cigarettes really the problem? And I would say no. E-cigarettes are really just the tip of the iceberg. E-cigarettes can be used. They can be used somewhat safely in certain populations, but in general, particularly among younger people, the problem is that they are spawning a generation of people who are at risk for addiction down the road. And we've spoken a lot about the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic didn't have to happen if people did not get sensitized to opioids from prescription pain medications early in the 2000s. If we didn't sensitize people in their 20s and teens to opioids back then, we wouldn't have the opioid problem that we have now in 2020. And I think that the e-cigarette epidemic is going to create a very similar path for people in the future. And when we hardwire, our young adults' brains to addiction, they may be addicted to opioids now, but there may be something down the road. Methamphetamine is the thing that many of us are worried about. In the late 2020s, when meth becomes much more common, even more common than it is now, we're setting off another generation of people who may be addicted. And addiction is a disease. And at some point, you're going to get addicted to something if you have addiction, and you may die from something that you're addicted to. And that's what is happening with all of the people who are dying from opioid overdoses. So we have to define the problem. We do surveillance. We try to understand how common the problem is. We do research on what causes addiction. And with vaping, we know that it's nicotine that causes addiction. We design programs, much like what you're hearing tonight is education, to try to prevent people from developing addiction. And the way we do that is early in life. You can't prevent addiction in your 30s because at that point, you either have the risk or you don't. So we want to prevent addiction by providing education to people in their teens and even younger. And then we develop policies to make the problem better. So the best example of this public health process is how we've essentially gotten rid of cigarette smoking. So what I'm showing to you here is the history of cigarette smoking dating back to the 1880s. And in the 1880s, there were a whole lot of different ways to smoke cigarettes. Wasn't always smoking. Sometimes you roll it, sometimes you dip it, sometimes you put it in your mouth and let it soak into your gums. But in the late 1940s, early 1950s, we started to see that cigarette smoking was a cause of cancer. And the first Surgeon General's report about the link between cigarettes and cancer came out in the late 1950s. And over the ensuing decades, dating up to recent history, 2000, we've had a series of policy changes that have been driven by research that showed that cigarette smoking causes cancer. And we know this to be very true right now. But it took a lot of efforts throughout the years, and it took a good 40 or 50 years to make cigarette smoking really quite rare. And so we're looking at traditional cigarette smoking being relatively rare now compared to 1950. And those adults on the call tonight will remember when, when we bought cars in the early 1980s, there were cigarette ashtrays on the backs of the front seats. There were ashtrays in the front seat. The cigarette lighter was actually a cigarette lighter, not a way that you would charge your phone. So these things were all changes that were made in the late 1970s and early 80s and 90s. But what we're seeing with e-cigarettes is a very concerning trend. So what I'm showing to you here is trends in any tobacco product use among high school students in New York State dating back to 2000, which isn't that long ago. And I want you to pay attention to the red line. The red line is any cigarette use. So these are traditional combustible cigarettes, your Marlboros and so forth. All right, and we've seen a pretty steady decline from 2000 up until 2016. All right, so roughly 80% decline in traditional cigarette smoking in those 16 years. In yellow is e-cigarettes. All right, so we weren't even paying attention to e-cigarettes before 2014. But obviously in 2014, 10% of high school students were using vape devices. 2018, it almost tripled to 27.4% of high school students using vape devices. And what's really concerning here is that that red line for the first time in 20 years is starting to go up. Now, there's no reason why cigarette use should be going up. In the face of the reality that most people in the high school years think that cigarette smoking is gross, there is a sign that traditional cigarette smoking is becoming more common. And we know that most people in high school find cigarette smoking to be very undesirable, and yet they're still smoking a little bit more than they were 2 years prior. And that is the power of addiction, okay? People are using these e-cigarette devices, becoming addicted to nicotine, and then they're finding another source of nicotine. And it turns out you can get a higher concentration of nicotine in some of these regular cigarettes, although there are some vape devices that you can get nicotine poisoning from too. So I don't want to be too casual there. The reality is that there's, for the first time in almost 20 years, now we're seeing an increase in the use of traditional cigarettes. And that is all because of the nicotine addiction that is happening in our high school students. So Juul, very, very popular. Juul didn't even exist in 2015. So 5-6 years ago, Juul was just nothing. And then it took off. And so by the time 2018 came around, it was the most popular e-cigarette device in the United States. It is probably not the most popular device now. It has fallen out of favor. There are new devices that are even more efficient than Juul, but there are a lot of people still using the Juul devices now because they are so easy and relatively affordable. So just to sum it all up, the problem that we have with chronic vaping is that youth who use vape devices put themselves at risk for nicotine addiction, which then in turn puts them at a 4 times more likely chance of having alcohol use, 8 times more likely chance of using marijuana, and a 22-fold increase in their likelihood of using cocaine. Okay, that's the power of addiction. And people who start using vape devices have no desire to become addicted, but that is the power of addiction. You don't have a choice. It damages the brain. It changes the way we hardwire our brain in our early 20s. There is a small chance that some of these devices can explode, and you've heard about that on airplanes and so forth. But the reality is that there's still a lot that we're learning about the e-cigarettes, and we don't really know the full picture of their risk, although we do know that there has been no documented benefit to using e-cigarettes other than that they may be enjoyable and all of those things, but there is no documented health benefit to using e-cigarettes. So here in Monroe County, turns out that we do surveys every 2 years of all high school students in Monroe County, and we ask them if you've ever used an e-cigarette device. And among high school students in Monroe County, as of 2019, 35% of high school students reported that they used an e-cigarette device ever. That is up from 31% just 4 years prior to that. Past month use, which is a sort of a different indicator of e-cigarette use, about 23% of high school students in 2019 said that they used a vape, compared to 20% just 4 years prior to that. We asked the students, why do you vape? 21% of them understand that they get a nicotine buzz. Not only do they feel it, they know why they're getting it. They know it's nicotine. 20% of them said that they use e-cigarettes to relax or to de-stress. 16% because their friends use it, and so forth. So there are a lot of reasons, but the most concerning here is that 21% understand that they're addicted, essentially. Okay, 3% actually said that they can't quit. They admitted essentially that they are already addicted. That's 3 out of 100 high school students who use vape indicate that they feel that they're addicted. Alcohol use, just as an aside, 42% of respondents ever drank alcohol. 21% used alcohol in the last month, which is actually less common than vaping. 12% of high school students engaged in binge drinking in the last month. Marijuana use is there, 30% ever using marijuana in high school. 19% of high school students have used marijuana in the last month. All of these figures are actually declining, okay? These sound common, but they're actually declining. So that's a good direction. But unfortunately, vaping is increasing. There's another way to look at things, broken down by the years in high school. Not surprisingly, as students progress in high school, you see a higher incidence of using alcohol, e-cigarettes, or marijuana. So marijuana, for example, 10% of high school freshmen had reported using marijuana in the last month in 2019, almost triple that in the same year using marijuana in 2019 among high school seniors. So when we think about what can we do about this, I think education is very important. There's a certain amount of education that we ought to be delivering to our community to help people understand the benefits, if there are any, and harms of these kinds of things. But I think it's also important, particularly for school leadership and for parents, to remember that there's a lot that we can do as parents and as adults to protect our children from the risks of using substances and becoming addicted. And so one of the things that I really like is when we do surveys of high school students, we ask what we call protective factors. We often focus on risk factors, the things that put our children at risk. But we also want to think about what are the things that help our children? What are the things that help protect them from making bad decisions? And so one of them that we ask among students is, do you feel like you get a lot of encouragement at school? And to our surprise, 62% of high school students say that they feel that they get a lot of encouragement at their school. 57% say that they feel like they matter in their community. 84% of high school students say that they know one or more adults other than their parents that they can go to discuss important questions about life. So I want you to remember these things, because it turns out that in students who report these things being true for them, they actually have a lower incidence of using alcohol, marijuana, vaping, or smoking other drugs. So on the first column there, for example, when students say that they agree or strongly agree with feeling that they receive encouragement at school, they have a much lower incidence of using these substances as compared to the students who disagree or feel that it does not apply to them. Kids who do not feel that they get encouragement at school are more likely to use alcohol, marijuana, vape, or smoke. Same thing is true with feeling like you matter in our community. Same thing is true if you feel like you have an adult who is not your parent who you can talk to about important issues. So this is a call to action for us as adults. What can we do to help our high school students and other students feel that they are getting encouragement at school? Sometimes it's just a simple, kind gesture. Sometimes it's volunteering in the community so that they feel like they're connected to something outside of just the district, that they're connected to the community, connected to the city, connected to their town or village, and then encouraging them to get involved in other ways so that they meet other adults who are not their parents, who they can talk to about whatever issue. So it's most commonly coaches, athletics, student activities, our churches. What can we do to help expose our children to productive activities outside of the home? That is very protective in helping our students to stay away from using alcohol and other drugs. So, of course, in 2020, COVID happened. And we're trying to understand what the impact of COVID is on vaping and, frankly, everything else. And unfortunately, we don't really have any good studies on this yet. Last year was a very bad year as far as doing good research on anything. The Youth Risk Behavior Survey that I referenced earlier, we do this every 2 years in the health department. It relies on kids being in school so that we can do these surveys. And 2020-21, the current academic year, would have been the year that we would have done this. But unfortunately, we haven't had a normal school year, as you all know. And so we have not, and we will not be doing the YRBS survey this year. Our plan is that 2021-22 will be a more normal year. And our hope is that we'll be able to do the survey in the next academic year. But unfortunately, we weren't able to do it in the year that we really wanted to do it. But I did ask a lot of our school counselors from across the community, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? No surprise, there's been an increase in mental health concerns. No surprise, there's been an increase in alcohol use in students and also in adults. Our teachers and our counselors are saying that they have actually seen fewer students initiating e-cigarette use, which I was a little surprised by, but we'll get into why I think that is. And those children, those students who were addicted already didn't change. So people who were using e-cigarettes very commonly tended to use them still, even in spite of COVID. So there was one study that was published on the use of e-cigarettes during COVID, and this was back in May of last year. And they found that among 2,000 users of e-cigarettes, 1,400 of them were underage. Under age 21, 700 were over the age of 21. Okay, so that gives you a breakdown of how common this is among younger adults. For those who reported a change in their e-cigarette use, surprisingly, the majority of them either quit or reduced their e-cigarette use, and we'll talk about why. A small number of them increased. An even smaller number of them started using cannabis, and then an even smaller number than that switched to a different type of e-cigarette. But the vast majority of people in this study, at least, either quit or decreased their use of e-cigarettes, which we think is a good thing. But of those who used, the vast majority of them started to get their products online and not on retail. And the concern with online is that there is a lot less ability to screen for your age online. That is a concern with online use, and you can even purchase online from a local store. But because of COVID, we weren't going out as much. People started to purchase their e-cigarette products online. When they looked at e-cigarette use on a national basis, this is a different study, comparing 2019 to 2020, they saw a decrease in the total use of e-cigarettes from 2019 to 2020. When they dug into why there was a decrease, the students reported that because they were at home and not in school, they weren't able to use their e-cigarettes because their parents were home too. Because most parents were not working in their offices. Everybody was working from home. And so that was actually one of the most common reasons. Inability to get the products, they weren't going out. They couldn't, get a box from Amazon or from some online thing because their parents would see it. 25% of the respondents in the survey understood that there were lung problems associated with e-cigarettes. So there is some positive news in that. But just to give you some background on what's happened in COVID in general, we've seen an increase in domestic violence calls. This is very concerning. This is very concerning, particularly among high school students, because of the prevalence of domestic abuse and partner violence and date rape. These have happened and it increased in 2020. We know the opioid crisis has not gone away. We are still finalizing numbers from 2020, but the initial data seem to suggest that 2020 will be the record-breaking year for opioid fatalities in Monroe County. So looking at the first half of 2020, we're already up to 126 fatalities. We had a total of 181 in the entire year in 2019. And so most of us think that we're going to see a record-breaking year for opioid overdose fatalities in Monroe County. Child abuse calls went down in Monroe County as well as across the country. It's not because child abuse was less common, but it was because nobody was able to see into people's homes where child abuse was happening because people weren't in school and weren't going to the doctors. And so most people who are mandatory reporters of child abuse weren't able to see this. So when child abuse was finally reported, turns out that the prevalence of very severe abuse was more common. So COVID has really inflicted a lot of damage on children at risk in our communities. And food insecurity, big reason. The most common reason for the increase in calls to 211 in 2020. A lot of people were struggling to get food on the table. A lot of people struggling to get housing taken care of, and a lot of mental health and substance use calls. So when you apply this to addiction, addiction is one of those conditions that seems to go together with all of these things. And so, you know, as we look ahead, as we look beyond COVID, as we look beyond 2021, I think now is the time that we need to be thinking about how do we prevent addiction, particularly among our youth. So with that, I will hand it back over to Principal Wilson. Be happy to take your questions.
Okay, very good. Well, Dr. Mendoza, thank you for the incredible amount of details, wide range of topics and statistics, and you can learn a lot from this, especially for the trend lines. I do have several questions that have come in. I have some questions that came in from some of our students and some from our Flash network, and then some from the public as well. The first question I can pose is from one of our parents. Can you explain how some kids vape and pass out, and what is happening to their bodies for this to happen? That real negative reaction where some students just kind of lose consciousness from vaping. Is there a general?
Well, you know, with vaping, it really depends on what you're vaping. It depends on what's in that liquid. But if you vape a lot, you can get nicotine poisoning. That's actually quite rare, but you can get nicotine poisoning if you vape a lot. And some of these Juul devices, you know, one Juul pod is equal to one pack of cigarettes. And so I hear students tell me, I smoke 2 or 3 Juul pods in a day. Well, us adults know that that's 2 to 3 packs of cigarettes. That's 60 cigarettes worth of nicotine in a day. And most people would agree that 3 packs of cigarettes is a lot of cigarette smoke. There is a lot of what we call a vasovagal response. When you inhale a hot liquid, sometimes that can go to our head, make all of our blood vessels dilate throughout all of our body, and it makes our head feel like we're getting lightheaded and pass out. That's the most common reason for people who are smoking anything to pass out. So that's most likely the reason, but there can be a whole lot of reasons for that.
Okay, very good. What are some signs? This is again from some parents. What are some signs of addiction from vaping that you can look for in your child? Average parent this is a new world. I've had many conversations myself as a result of vaping incidents at the school, and parents often ask me, you know, how did this happen? I had no idea. And are there some signs that you could share with families around signs of addiction?
So I really struggle with this question because a lot of people say, well, I wish I could have seen something. Or people will say, well, this kid came from a good household. The reality is, you know, even the most loving, caring parents may not see these signs, and there are not necessarily consistent signs from all kids. And I don't want those out there who are listening who may have missed those signs to feel like they were at fault. I don't think we do well as a community pointing fingers and saying, well, why didn't you see this? The reality is it's really, really hard. And you know, I can offer some possibilities, but none of these are perfect. You know, in general, I say that parents know their kids the best. I hope of any adult in the community, it's the parents among us who know our kids the best. And whenever you have in your gut that feeling that something might be different, I want you to explore that. I want you to talk to your children. What is that about? Okay, your gut as a parent is the most important intuition that you have. If you see your child sleeping more or sleeping less, if you see a change in the way they dress, if you see a change in the way they are participating in their schoolwork or sports or activities, if you see a change that's different, if you see a change in their mood, if you see a change in their happiness, if you, smell things, if you see them sneaking around. But the reality is you don't have to see any of those things, and your children may be using things that you don't know about. So, we do everything we can as parents. We love our children like nothing else in the world.
Right.
And yet sometimes the power of addiction can be so strong that we will miss these signs. And so the best thing that we can do as parents is to educate them, help our kids to make the right decisions, and to feel like they can ask us questions. I want my children, I've got a high school student at home. I don't pretend to understand everything that goes on in the high school, and I'm never going to. I'm not a high school student. But I want my daughter to come to me and say, what is that? Tell me, Dad, tell me what is that people are doing and why do they do that? That's what I want as a parent. But to say that every time we can see all these signs is just short-sighted. The reality is, this happens to the best of homes and the best of parents and the best of kids. So, we just got to do everything we can to show our kids that we love them and we care about them no matter what.
Keep the communication open.
Yeah.
And schools can help with that. That's part of my job. My assistant principals are counselors and teachers. When we have incidents, it does open doors and it starts a conversation. So thank you. Another question that's coming up, I've seen come up a couple different times, this theme with the new legalization of marijuana. What do you think some of the implications on vaping may occur now that marijuana has been legalized in New York State?
We all knew that this was happening, and we're surprised that, it didn't happen 2 years ago. We understand that this is an economic decision. There are a whole host of social justice issues that date back to the 1920s about why marijuana was illegal in the first place. The reality is alcohol is far more dangerous than marijuana is in almost every respect. But what marijuana does is it introduces another way for children to become addicted. And so I get very nervous about marijuana. It's obviously not just smoking marijuana. It's the gummies, it's the edibles, all these other things that cause, impairment. Okay, it causes that dopamine in our brain to feel pleasure in our brain, and it drives us toward that addictive personality that we don't want to have going into our 20s. So, marijuana is just another addictive thing in my view from a public health standpoint. It's like underage drinking, it's like underage smoking. It's just one more thing for people to become addicted to. And, we just need to be, very vigilant as adults to follow our young adults and help them to make the right decisions.
Okay, very good. For Mr. Lipinski and Mr. Tabone's class, a student poses this question. And I appreciate this question because I can see it coming from a lens of a teenager. After being addicted, if you decide to quit, will your lungs ever fully recover in future years? So what's the long-term effect from a kid's lens?
Right, that's a really good question. And it depends on what you're using. So for traditional combustible cigarettes, there are a whole host of benefits that happen over the months and years after you quit smoking. The addiction part doesn't really ever go away. Remember, your brain is hardwired toward addiction in your early 20s and mid 20s. So when we think of recovery from addiction, that's not a destination. That's a path. That's a path that you have for the rest of your life, and that's a path that you've got to guard for the rest of your life. And so people who had been addicted to alcohol or to smoking or to opioids, they've got to work really hard every day to protect themselves from not using those substances that they were addicted to. And it can be a different thing. Okay, just because you're addicted to opioids now doesn't mean you're not going to get addicted to alcohol later. So addiction is the disease, the drug is the vehicle. But when it comes to the physiology of our lungs, it depends on what we're using. So like I said earlier, some of the inhaled flavors in these e-cigarettes can cause permanent scarring in our lungs. We're actually seeing this with COVID, okay? Some people are recovering from COVID, but a lot of people, once they get COVID lung, that does not look like it's changing, okay? So that's basically inflammation. And so when you use an e-cigarette, if it causes that inflammation, that's not gonna go away. I have patients who are 11, 12 years old who are healthy, who started to use vaping devices and are no longer able to participate in cross country or hockey or sports. And that's because of the damage that's permanent from some of these devices. So is it always going to happen? No. Is it usually going to happen? No. But can it happen sometimes? Yes, unfortunately. And that is what makes vaping so challenging.
And risky.
Yeah.
It just comes to the risk.
Yeah.
Another question, what could you offer to parents seeking help for students? Maybe they've had a case or two, they've uncovered vaping's going on with their teenager.
Mhm.
They suspect addiction to nicotine. What would be some suggestions you could offer families?
Well, when you find out, that's usually a good day. Obviously, it's a very challenging day because you're disappointed. And as parents, we take it personally when we see our children doing things that we don't want them to do. But to get to that day is actually a challenge. And I think once you get to that day and you learn about it, that's an opportunity that you have to start working together. But I want to back up a little bit and try to help all of us as parents with that very elusive, how do we find that kind of stuff out? So talk to your kids' parents, okay, your kids' friends' parents. Get to know the network, get to know where they are, get to know what they're doing, what do they like to do, what kinds of things are they unsupervised, and sometimes they will be, and that's appropriate. Talk to your kids. The best time for me to talk to my kids is not at the dinner table because that's awkward, right? You ask your kids, so what's going on? They don't want to talk about that stuff when they're eating. So when I'm driving them to sports and we see a billboard that has an image of somebody smoking, I'll say, yeah. So do you know anybody who's smoking? And parents in the audience, your kids are a captive audience when they're in the car. They have no way of escaping. They are your audience. So take advantage of those moments. But when you get to the point where you have a disclosure, where when your kid tells you something, first thing you say is, thank you for telling me that. Took a lot of courage to tell me something that might have potentially made me disappointed in you. And I am not disappointed in you. I'm proud of you for telling me what you just did. That takes a lot of courage. You thank them for that. Okay, that's really important because you want to have that conversation with your kids. And then you break down that wall, you start having a conversation, you start understanding what's going on, and you continue the conversation. But try to resist the urge to lash out in frustration, because it takes our kids a whole lot of courage and strength to share things like that with us as parents.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more. A follow-up to that question. I had a question specific to the nicotine patches, that replacement therapy.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure if you have any statistics or background on that could help parents understand, because I know many parents, and I'll take them to the doctors, would like to explore. So I'm not sure if that's a viable solution.
Well, I tend to be very cautious about using nicotine replacement in younger people. It can be done, but it's risky. It's not FDA approved at below a certain age. I can't tell you the last time I used nicotine replacement in somebody who's younger than 21. I use it in 21-year-old and older adults often, because what you're trying to do is give them a safer way to have that nicotine that doesn't involve smoking or vaping, which in and of themselves are more dangerous. So nicotine that's on a patch on your skin is literally just giving you nicotine and nothing else. And that gives your body a way to sort of taper yourself off, wean yourself off the nicotine. So that's that's FDA approved. That's a good way to quit smoking. But vaping has not been shown to have that kind of benefit, unfortunately.
Okay. And I guess one other question, because of impact of COVID here, I guess question is for someone who's vaping and has that addiction and then contracts COVID, have you seen any statistics that connect the symptoms and the impact of the illness? Are those related? Is there any, maybe it's too early with the data?
It's really too early to know.
Okay.
We don't, as you all know, there are people who get COVID and never have symptoms. And then there are people who get COVID, get intubated on a breathing machine and pass away. There's a huge variation in COVID illness. With these new COVID variants that we're seeing a younger population getting sick compared to last fall. Now, is it because the younger population isn't vaccinated as much as the older population? Perhaps. Is it because the younger population is more likely to gather and do sports and restaurants? That's possible. But the worry that we have about these new COVID variants, and we now believe that the COVID variant, the UK B117 variant, is now 2/3 of all the variants in the United States. There is a worry that the new variant is easier for younger people to contract because of something either in the virus or something about children that makes it more likely for younger people to get the illness. So this is something that we're studying. I put this all out there because you don't want anything to damage your lungs. And we don't know exactly how COVID damages all lungs. Some people get no damage and some people get awful damage. We don't totally understand that. So what we want to do is prevent COVID as much as we can to help keep people healthy. But vaping plus COVID is just, a double whammy, if you will.
Right, exactly. Okay. Well, this is bringing us to our conclusion of our presentation tonight. I want to thank you on behalf of our school community and our Flash network to help raise our awareness, to educate our community, our families, our students, the principal with additional details. I learned a lot from our conversations this evening, and I can't tell how much I appreciate to take time out of your very busy schedule to address this equally important topic.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you to you and your community for making this a priority.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Take care.